Scout of the Endless Frontier, Episode 2, Oathbound in a Lawless Frontier, written and read by Elton Gar. Rust ran the length of the Ghost Wake, stopping just short of jumping up on Elias, then ran back to the door. He was always excited to land on a planet, and more so when Elias told him he could go outside. Elias tried to ignore the dog and checked the last living organism from Calthera 6. It hadn't been growing the way he had hoped. As he added a few more drops of water, he wondered if some things were just so damaged that, even if they survived, they lost the ability to grow. But he wasn't willing to give up. If all it could do was survive, then survival would have to be good enough. He then crossed the 10 steps of the Ghost Wake and put his thumb on the door pad. There was a hiss and it opened. The planet wasn't a paradise, but according to the report from the scout, there was abundant fruit. If he could fill his empty cargo hold, and if Rust was less restless, he could avoid returning to civilized territories for a few more weeks. The fresh smell of a living world was a stark contrast to the recycled air of the Ghost Wake. Rust was excited and ran around the Ghost Wake as fast as he could, while Elias made a more careful circuit around the ship. He almost reminded the dog to be careful, but there were no signs of risk on the planet. So, instead, he used the curved Zhen'ik blade to cut a stick about 3 feet long. Rust saw the stick and rushed over to Elias and danced around in front of him, excited by the possibility of a simple game. Elias threw the stick as hard as he could. It spun out perfectly into the deep grass. He watched from the shade of a tree with just enough wind to keep him comfortable in the warm sunlight, thinking a few weeks here might be a good idea. Then he spotted something that shouldn't be here. It was a shuttle, too small for an FTL drive, but a colony would have been on the official register. So he whistled as loud as he could and began to rush towards the Ghost Wake, trusting Rust would catch up. Before he reached the door, the shuttle had landed, so he drew the Talon. Hiding behind the edge of the ship, there were only 4 people. He had faced worse odds in the war, but 2 were Zhen'ik. Seeing that, he holstered the Talon. He had made an oath, so he called out, "I'm just a scout, collecting supplies." That should have been enough. Scouts were universally known as apolitical. They were even exempt from the laws that required people to report broken laws and even illegal colonies, because it let them do important jobs like judging, guiding, and sometimes even acting as sheriffs. It also meant he wouldn't have much worth stealing. Excluding himself, he had never heard of a scout continuing after getting a payout that would make them worth robbing. Most of them would sign terrible contracts for a ship barely worth the effort of salvaging for parts, and if they were lucky, they might even earn enough to keep the hold full. Instead, the human said, "Surrender, and we'll have no reason to kill you." Pirates were bad enough, but every sign was that these were bad pirates, and that made them much more dangerous. Professional pirates knew the value of a scout and even paid for information. "Okay, I'm coming out." He holstered the Talon. If they didn't see the weapon, they just assumed he had hidden it. He then adjusted the Zhen'ik blade so it couldn't be missed. That wouldn't mean much to the human Arbetrian, but if the Zhen'ik saw it, that might save his life. The human pirate grinned, showing a mouth of black, twisted, and missing teeth, and said, "I got some news for you. This is gonna be your new home. Just open the ship, and we'll leave you alive." Elias continued to walk slowly forward until he was certain one of the Zhen'ik soldiers saw the blade. It made a short squeak. Then the dull, flat voice of a translator said, "Where did you get that blade?" The irritated look of the human's face suggested he was in charge, but it was hard to enforce slavery without a society, and even harder when the slaves were armed. "I took it off the body of a Zhen'ik priest," Elias said. The grin returned to the human's face. There weren't a lot of humans who understood Zhen'ik traditions, but it slipped when the Zhen'ik said, "Get on the shuttle." As Elias approached, the human took the Talon from its holster and shoved it into his belt. He then reached for the dagger, but the stick-like arms of the Zhen'ik grabbed his wrist. "You will not touch that." "He just said he killed one of your priests to get it. Besides, I don't want him armed in my shuttle." Elias could have pushed the issue and likely won, but he had researched Zhen'ik culture in the last years, and his understanding was likely more useful than the dagger. So he reached slowly into one of his pouches and took out a 4-foot-long yellow cloth with thread embroidery. He then drew the dagger out carefully between the tips of his fingers and slowly wrapped the blade so none of the metal was showing. With the weapon secure, he lowered his head and held out the blade to the nearest of the Zhen'iks. The alien ran its finger over the cloth, and both Zhen'ik soldiers said something in unison in a language that wasn't translated. It then took the dagger and said, "I will protect this with my life." Elias answered, "One could argue that would go against the oath I took. Protect it, so long as you are safe, but do not allow any Zhen'ik to come to harm by my actions." The Zhen'ik said something Elias couldn't understand, but he's pretty sure that whether they knew it or not, the human and the Betrian were outnumbered. Seeing the inside of the shuttle, Elias once again worried for his safety. The overall filth of the shuttle suggested both a lack of maintenance and made him wonder what diseases he'd get from being in it. The others got into the shuttle, and just as the doors were about to shut, Rust ran onto the ship, a large stick pointing out of both sides of his mouth. He glanced around, then dropped the stick at Elias's feet. He bent down and rubbed the top of Rust's head. As he did, he said quietly enough so that the others might not hear it, "Stay alert, boy." The pirates' base was both bigger and less impressive than Elias had expected. There were 6 old, broken ships in a circle. He doubted any of them could fly, and none had any weapons. These pirates weren't just bottom feeders. They were the bottom feeders who had been left behind to watch the base, while the more competent bottom feeders went hunting. The shuttle landed roughly, taking its place in the circle of old ships. Even though this place couldn't have been here more than a year or two, everything looked worn and broken. The edges of the ship were rusted, and the door he was led to was attached by one hinge, so they had to hold it in place to avoid it falling off when it opened. The interior was no better. It had been a cargo hold for a ship no bigger than the Ghostwake. The only thing in it was a couple of empty plastic boxes. "You can wait here for the boss to come back," the human said. "We will bring the necessary supplies," the Zhen'ik soldier said, getting a dirty look from the human. At the same time, Russ came into the room, still holding his stick. Then, as the human fiddled with the handle locking the broken door, Rust walked in circles around the room. Getting out of the makeshift prison wouldn't have been difficult. The lock barely kept the door from falling open. The real security was he was a month's walk from the Ghostwake. Russ was still chewing on his stick when the Zhen'ik soldier came in. The blade, still wrapped carefully, was in a secure pouch in his belt that looked nicer than anything he had seen any of them wear. It also carried a large metal box. He put it down, then sat on top of the box and watched Elias. Zhen'ik were more comfortable with silence than humans, but it might also be important, so Elias didn't break that silence. Russ broke it a few minutes later as he continued to chew on his stick. That seemed to be enough, and the warrior said, "I would hear the story." Elias was afraid of that. He didn't fully understand the Zhen'ik's morality or ethics. No alien race saw them exactly the same. What he knew was that they didn't see death the same way humans did. Perhaps that was because they were born by the thousands. The eggs created a massive swarm of Zhen'ik, but only a dozen or so lived past the first few months of childhood. Or perhaps it was something else entirely. But, no matter how you saw it, Elias was the villain of the story he was about to tell. "It was during the war. I had been promoted to Special Forces. My unit was to avoid the main battlefront and slip behind enemy lines. We found a town. It had no real strategic value. It had no soldiers, just workers, and even those were not there because of their caste, but because they were too young to fight. That wasn't uncommon. The Zhen'ik were fighting to not be enslaved, and by the end of the war they hadn't held back anything. But he wanted the Zhen'ik to know that Elias understood exactly what he had done." The huge eyes of the Zhen'ik watched him, but, unlike what a human would do, it didn't prompt him to continue, so Elias took a moment to compose himself, and then said, "They were unarmed. It wouldn't have mattered. We were the best soldiers humanity had. We killed them in the fields, in their homes, and in the holes they tried to hide in. We even burnt the eggs. I'd like to claim I was afraid not to join in, or that the drugs they gave us overrode my judgment. Others claim that. But I know I had a choice. What I chose can only be called murder." "Including the priest," the Zhen'ik said, the flat voice giving nothing of his thoughts or opinions away. "No, by then we knew your priests do not fight or work. So we left them, knowing your soldiers will walk into gunfire to protect them, and your workers would go hungry to feed them. Because of that, the temple was the only place that wasn't filled with bodies." "It is not a temple. It is something else." He had been told that before, but he just moved on. "Whatever it was, I threw up in it. That was when the priest approached me. He was the oldest Zhen'ik I had ever seen. Now, I know all of your priests are elderly. He sat with me in silence, like you do now. After a few minutes, I said the only thing I could, that I was sorry, that I didn't want to do this anymore. And he gave you a choice. One I didn't understand." He drew his dagger. "He said that one of us would die, and the other would make an oath to never kill another member of the dead man's race." A wise man speaks to both your strength and your weakness in the same breath. Perhaps. Either way, I agreed, and then I dropped my own weapons. Then I turned my back. I expected he would stab me. Instead, I heard him fall. He had stabbed himself in the stomach. All he said before he died was to take up the oath blade and carry it until I decided to give up the oath. The Zhen'ik nodded and then said, I would let you go, but your people understand the use of oaths without their value. Every member of our race who is allowed to live has sworn an oath, and we do not break our oaths as humans do. As he spoke, Russ came over to Elias, who said, What did you bring me? Food, water, and your weapon, though I am forced to ask you to not use it while you are here. Elias nodded and said, I understand. Then, standing, he swung the branch that Russ had been carrying as hard as he could into the Zhen'ik's body. The hard shell held, as Elias had known it would, but, as strong as the alien was, they were lighter than humans, and it fell backwards. Elias grabbed his pistol out of the box, then, on a whim, shoved as many of the field rations as he could into his jacket. He was here to resupply. Finally, he bent over the Zhen'ik and took the blade from his belt and unwrapped it. As he did, he said, I'm not done with this yet. I sent my brother to gather fruit, and it seems I am too hurt to fight you, the Zhen'ik said. That, Elias suspected, was very nearly breaking his own oath, because he had fought Zhen'ik before, and this one was barely injured. Rather than consider that, he flipped the charger switch on the side of the Talon. The plasma pistol hummed, and then, in about 4.5 seconds, beeped. How many others were left behind? 3, the human, and 2 Betrians. Elias considered that, and then said, Rust, get on the shuttle, and make sure no one else gets on. Rust barked, and Elias was glad, not for the first time, that he had picked a dog that was genetically altered to be smarter. The stick might have just been a lucky accident, but he doubted it. Should I hit you again? Elias asked, as he glanced at the door. That should be unnecessary, the Zhen'ik warrior said. May you become an honored elder, Elias responded. I suspect my race will have few of those. Elias understood. The humans wouldn't have to treat the Zhen'ik harshly to enslave them. The oaths that they had been forced to swear held them as well as chains. But he also knew the history of how humans treated those they had power over. They would try to break their culture, even if ultimately that worked against the best interest of the humans. There was nothing he could do about that. He just hoped the pirates were spread out. Escaping wouldn't be a problem, so long as the Talon had time to recharge. As soon as Elias stepped out, Rust ran as fast as he could towards the shuttle, the stupid stick in his mouth again. But it distracted the pirates, who were, of course, all standing together. But it was too late to change his tactics now, so he shot. The plasma was slower than a bullet and brighter, but it was still too fast to dodge, and it left a hole in the center of the human, who seemed to understand what had happened in the split second before he fell to the ground dead. The high-pitched whine of the plasma pistols recharging filled Elias's awareness as the 2 Betrians moved towards him. The Betrians were a minor race in the Commonwealth. They only inhabited 3 planets, and only one had a large population. But they were far more common in the military. He'd never found them overtly aggressive, but they both looked and had the strength of a bear, which made them exceptional close-range combatants. And they must have been well-trained enough to recognize the plasma pistol, because they didn't draw their own weapons. That would have given Elias a chance to get to cover, and in a firefight, Elias would likely win. Instead, they rushed forward, taking the seconds they had to cross the distance, making the pistol far less useful. Elias moved backwards as fast as he could, but the Betrians crossed the distance just as the plasma pistol beeped, telling him that its next shot was ready. Without years of combat training, that wouldn't have mattered. Whichever he shot, the other would kill him. He needed the extra seconds, so he held back, letting the first of the creatures hit him. The large creature drove him backwards, hitting the metal wall of one of the ships, and as Elias hit the ship, the plasma pistol fired. The large, hairy creature fell on him, pinning him to the wall as the pistol began to recharge. He held on to the bodies. The other Betrian stepped forward and tried to toss it to the side. That gave Elias another half a second at most, but he only needed a handful of seconds, nearly an eternity in a fight with an enemy that could rip you to shreds. The second time the Betrian grabbed the body, Elias let it go, and instead rolled to his side. The pain of broken ribs made the world go dim as he did, but he still heard the whine of his pistol recharging. A huge clawed hand grabbed him. The Betrian was already raising his other hand, each of the claws like a knife. Elias didn't see a way out. After 100 worlds, he was going to be killed by an angry pirate because he needed 2 more seconds. He should have given up on his oath. He could have killed the 4 soldiers of the ship easily enough, but as his finger wrapped around the dagger's hilt, he decided he'd rather die than break that oath. But dying wasn't the plan, and he slashed out with the dagger. Even if he hadn't been injured, fighting a Betrian with a knife wasn't a winning strategy. Then, something he hadn't counted on happened. Russ grabbed the Betrian by the back of the leg. The dog was too small to really hurt him, but very few aliens had the concept of pets, and a wild animal was scary to anyone. So rather than swinging his claws down to cut Elias, he reflexively turned on the unexpected attack. That was enough for Elias, and he drove the dagger deep into the Betrian's shoulder, forcing him to let go of Elias. The smart choice would have been to scramble backwards. In about a second and a half, his pistol could fire again, but Rust wouldn't last that long. So he continued to attack, slashing at the Betrian as fast as the curved dagger and his broken ribs allowed. As the Betrian drew back its good arm to attack, Elias lifted the plasma pistol and pointed it at him. The Betrian saw the talon and froze. Elias carefully stepped backwards, never letting the gun move away from him. Then it beeped, ready to fire again. The bluff had given him the last seconds he needed. He considered shooting the Betrian, but there was no need. If it tried to attack, Elias only needed to flex his finger. Then, once he was far enough back to relax, he reached down, took the small first aid kit from his belt, and tossed it to the Betrian. He saw the other Zhen'ik as he got into the shuttle. It was loading boxes full of local fruit. He nodded at Elias and walked past him, showing no signs of fear. Behind him, the stick hit the shuttle door as Russ got on. Elias picked up the keycard sitting on the pilot's chair, started the shuttle, and flew back to the Ghost Wake. Author's note. From before I had the name Elias, I knew that he had done something terrible in the war. And, while I considered holding that back longer, I decided that it was vital to understand his character. Just like the Commonwealth being extraordinarily flawed is vital to its character. Because one of the things I love to write about is hope. And for hope to matter, things have to start in a place that needs it. This story was also longer than I intended, so I'll let it speak for itself and just say that if you want to see more, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to read other stories by me, you can subscribe to my newsletter at www.andascifi.com to get a free book, or sign up as a free member of my Patreon to get access to a lot of short stories. Thank you, Elton Gar.